My family and I decided we don't want this accident to ruin our life. We are deliberately going to make this a happy story. And so we decided that we were going to celebrate the day of the accident as a holiday, not as the day I almost died, but as the day that I survived. And thank the people in our lives, thank ourselves for navigating that tough moment.
Welcome to Normalize the Conversation. I'm your host, Francesca Reicherter, and today I'm joined by Naseem Rochette, author of The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over. In this episode, Naseem shares her journey of surviving being run over 3 times and how this traumatic experience empowered her to take control of her narrative. Join us as we discuss celebrating your Unbreakable Day and the vital ways to support loved ones after trauma. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am very excited for our conversation, but before we begin, I want to check in. How are you really?
I am actually really good. I'm having a good day.
I love to hear it. My day's looking up. I am in grad school getting ready to graduate, like last set of final exams, papers, presentations, right? All ending so close. And that's a very stressful time. And the one thing I look forward to is Fridays because I get to record podcast episodes. So you're making my day look up. Thank you.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to hear it. Well, I actually started a new job 2 weeks ago. And although I'm in kind of the hustle and bustle of drinking from the fire hose, learning so much, I feel so excited about the people that I'm working with, that I feel connected. And it's a really nice feeling.
Yeah, it is a really nice feeling when you kind of find a place where you feel connected to people, where you feel. So I'm in grad school, I'm an intern. And when I work with people that I don't feel very connected to, not only do I feel isolated, but I second guess myself a lot. I'm like, is there something wrong with me? Why don't we feel connected? So I think it also helps with like a sense of kind of self-confidence.
I think you were spot on. I was talking to somebody about burnout recently. And I said, one of the, I think burnout sometimes doesn't necessarily have to do with the volume of work.
Yeah.
It's sometimes just feeling like you're running uphill because you aren't connected. You have no one to celebrate the milestones with and the successes with. So it's very lonely. And I think when you feel lonely, work is that much harder. And I think that is a real contributing factor to the burnout.
Absolutely. It is so much of that emotional aspect. That toll of feeling like there's so much on your plate and you're alone in it and you don't have that kind of community to lean on during it.
Yeah.
I love what I do, but the more things I do on my own, the more burnt out I feel. It's just having that kind of connection and people to lean on, to, like you said, and you feel like you're going uphill so much by yourself. I mean, you get exhausted.
Yeah, you need a tribe.
You do. So you have an amazing story. For those who are not watching but listening, The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over. I really enjoyed your book for so many different reasons. I do want to let you share a bit about your story before I jump in with everything I want to say, because I will take over. But I do want to say that you have an amazing story, and I'm excited for you to share it with our listeners.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for having me on the show. So, let me give you the quick story for all your listeners. So, on May 21st, 2018, I was hit and run over by a car 3 times. The car hit me, stopped, drove forward over me, reversed over me, and then drove forward over me a third time, and I was pinned underneath the car. The tires actually went over my, head and body five times. And my husband watched this whole thing. I was in a pedestrian crosswalk crossing towards him. So there's so much more to that story. That's the quick version. And throughout that experience, I was conscious in that moment. So, I remember every second of it. For me, it was about 20 minutes, even though it was a matter of seconds. And, obviously a very traumatic moment and a very traumatic yet enlightening journey of recovery.
Reading the book, one thing that really stood out to me was the amount of hope you held on to the entire time. It sounded like, even when you're detailing what it was like in those moments, it sounds like it felt like a piece of you was always kind of holding on to the strength and looking for the brighter side of
Aw.
it during all of it. And I thought that was a very, very kind of special and unique perspective. A lot of times we get so something happens to us and we get stuck in to us, right? And there's
Yeah.
just, I don't even have the words, but so much of it was, well, even feeling sorry for the driver a couple of times.
Well, it's interesting, and I told you I love the work you're doing because the stories of resilience are really important to have in your kind of inventory of knowledge. And I think that when I went into that moment that day, over the course of my life, I had heard other stories of people going through horrible things and navigating and surviving. And so, on some level, I thought, I always thought, oh, wow, if something really horrible happens to me, I hope I can come out stronger. But I'm going to say, it's not really that easy. I think, and I'm glad you can see that there was some piece of me that always stayed optimistic, or I shouldn't, maybe optimistic isn't the right word, but hopeful, that I would return to a happy life. But in those first days and weeks and months, the person I was and that happy life that I had was really nowhere to be found. And it took a lot of work and intention to reframe the story, to believe that I can get back to a happy life and a happy story. Um, but I'm really glad that shows through.
What do you think really helped you get to that point? Because yeah, I can only imagine what it would be like to go through all of that because not only there's also that physical reminder, right? When you look in the mirror, the physical pain that you're in. So you're really going through it. How did you get to that place where there was one thing you said in the book that I had read to you before, like you write your story. How did you get to the place where that kind of shift happened?
Well, there were a couple things that happened. So when the accident first happened and I was underneath the car, I mentioned that I was conscious. And in those moments, I had my end of life thoughts. I was listening to my husband's screams and other people's screams. And, I was 100% sure that I was dying. When the car drove over me the second time, I thought I was done. I didn't think there was any chance of surviving. And I started reflecting on my life. And, I said today, I'm feeling good today. I was actually feeling good that day as well. And, at that moment, for me to be feeling as happy as I was, I call that my first, hard fought journey. I was a very insecure young person. Took me a long time to become a person I liked. But, by that day, I was 47 years old on that day. I had, three kids who were, still youngish. They were, elementary, middle school. I was working full time. I had a full, robust life that I was proud of, that I had accomplished and felt good about. And, as I said in those moments, as I reflected, I thought, you know what? I might be dying, but I did have a good life. And, I thought about, oh, my kids do know who I am. They know how much I love them. But then there were other people that I thought, don't necessarily know how much I love them. And so I thought about, I reflected on life a little bit. And then, so much more to the story, but, I came out of the hospital, not that same person. But a couple things happened that helped me, start to reframe. So, when I first came out of the hospital, I couldn't see, I couldn't walk, the tires ran over my head and neck. I had a very, traumatic brain injury. I was cut all over. Miraculously, I didn't break any bones, as you probably read, but I was completely broken. And, a couple things happened that were really instrumental to me navigating the journey. The first was actually a tragedy that happened to my brother. His dog died. And when his dog died, I just thought, oh my gosh, I want to help him. But at that moment, I wasn't accepting help from anybody. I'd been run over 3 times, and I didn't want anyone to help me. I didn't want anyone to see me, with all broken. But when my brother's dog died, I wanted to help him. And, I didn't know how. And I remember feeling like, oh my gosh, there must be a way. And I started realizing I needed to help him, as, just as much for me as for him. Because the accident, and that's when I started to realize the accident didn't just happen to me. It happened to everyone that loved me, not just my husband that was watching, but my kids who no longer had a strong mother, my friends who no longer had their friend that they could depend on. And so that was the first thing that kind of got my wheels turning of how do I support them, and let them help. And then the other thing that happened was as much as I wouldn't accept help from my friends, I fortunately started seeing a trauma therapist after, kind of much cajoling. And this trauma therapist taught me about the philosophy and art of kintsugi, where you take a broken piece of pottery and you don't just glue it back together, you put it back together with a gold inlay, and you celebrate the cracks of the vase and celebrate the journey of that vase. And it gave me a new way to talk about my injuries and my struggles as part of my journey, not as a victim, but this is what's happened to me. And we talked a few minutes ago about burnout. What I realized too is I started to share my story and my cracks, not as a victim, but this is my journey. Other people started to share their stories and the things they were going through. And I was building this community of people that I could celebrate with, the milestones I had, like walking up the stairs or taking a shower, which don't seem like big deals, but are very big deals when you can't lift your arm or open your eyes or move your body. And having people to celebrate those things with, started to give me hope because I was seeing progress, and started to give them hope sometimes in the struggles they were going with. And I think that drove this positive energy. And my family and I decided we don't want this accident to ruin our life. We are deliberately going to make this a happy story. And so we decided that we were going to celebrate the day of the accident as a holiday, not as the day I almost died, but as the day that I survived. And thank the people in our lives, thank ourselves for navigating that tough moment. And look, I'm not going to say any of this was easy. This was a very hard year, several years, but reframing it and sharing just gave us all so much strength and hope to navigate.
And it gives so many people hearing your story strength and hope. And there's so many things you said I want to touch on, but first of all, the Unbreakable Day. So when I started reading this book, it was, I think, the day before the anniversary of my last suicide attempt that led me into the psych unit. And going into that day every year, a lot comes up. And when I read it as a day to celebrate, like that you're still here, that you're alive, it really shifted this fear of I have to go through this alone, and kind of contemplating, why am I still here, and going down that rabbit hole. Instead, I texted my friends and I was like, let's go get cake or something. Let's celebrate this. So the very first page of the book changed the way I approached my year going into the day that's usually one of the toughest. So thank you for that. And but that's exactly what this book is. That's exactly what your story is. And then one of the jokes that I loved in this book, was it a chai latte? Because you were like,
Oh, yes.
it's because of the milk. I didn't break any bones. It's such a serious, heartfelt book, but there's also so many moments of kind of laughter that really you get to know your personality and it doesn't feel like a heavy read. Whereas a
Good.
lot of times when you're hearing someone's story, it can feel so difficult for the reader to take in. But just the way you share it, there's moments of like brevity where you laugh. And I just think this book really gave me a lot of reframe on everything, not just that the way I approach this day, but for example, what you said about people helping you. You wrote in the book how, sometimes people are just looking for a way to like help and control an uncontrollable situation. And I never like to ask for help. And I was like, wow, everyone, like you said, we're all going through my experience in different ways. And by being able to help in some way, it does give you just a little bit of like you want to be there for someone you don't know how, and just a little bit of being able to help can really does make a difference.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I'm most grateful to learn, but I know it's one of the harder lessons for most of us because socially we've been brought up to be strong. And the idea of strength is so clear, like you don't ask for help, you carry the burden, you do it yourself, you make it look easy. And then, but I really feel lucky that I got to learn that accepting help and letting people help and is actually a dimension of strength because it's not just, as you said, necessarily for yourself. It's to give other people a way to contribute, to move forward, to feel like they're adding value in a time that is so tough for everybody.
Were there moments where you felt like people were trying to help, but I feel like you touched on it a bit in the book, maybe they were saying the wrong thing or approaching it in a way that wasn't necessarily as helpful?
Yeah, I think one of the actually very simple, seemingly innocuous things that people did that actually caused a lot of internal struggle for me was when people would say, "How are you?" And it seems so simple and, it's well intentioned, but I wasn't okay. And I didn't want to lie to them and say, "I'm fine." But I didn't want to say, I'm not okay and these are all the things that are going on because that's not actually probably what they wanted to know. They wanted to just share that they care so that was actually a very, very hard question. And what I tell people now is if somebody's going through crisis or trauma, don't ask them how they are. Just say, "I'm here for you. I'm thinking about you." But questions can be very, very hard in those moments when your head is spinning, when you don't have like I couldn't do simple things. My mind wasn't working. And so simple questions were just exhausting.
Yeah. And I mean, how are you to begin with is often just such a greeting. It's something that people say and they don't always want a response just in general. They're not thinking about getting a response. They're just thinking like, hey, how are you? And like you said, also people want to show that they care. And there's not a lot of conversation on how to do that without asking, like, how are you? Or what can I do? And although those are really great questions, sometimes people don't have the ability to answer them. So, what are other things you can do? And I know something that's always helped me. My younger cousin, who's one of my best friends, Bella, she's a pro at this with me. Just she knows that all she has to do is sit down next to me and put like her hand on my shoulder. And she's like, I'm here. And that's sometimes all you need. But
That's so powerful.
it's so powerful. Sometimes we think we have to ask a bunch of questions, but really our presence can make such a difference.
Yeah, you were spot on. And just, you know, providing that presence, whether through a text or a phone message or just saying, "I'm here, I love you, I'm thinking about you. If you need anything, call," but not asking questions. I think that makes
Exactly.
a
It's
difference.
the way you show up matters. And when you have someone who's going through something, you want to be there. And that's amazing. Or hopefully you want to be there. If you do, that's amazing. But learning, right? Learning
Yeah.
is to show up in a way that makes both of you feel supported in that moment is very helpful.
Well, you actually bring up something else really interesting is, you hope that people show up, but what I found is Sometimes you expect them to show up in a certain way, or certain people you just assume will be there when you're in crisis. And sometimes they don't show up. And it's not necessarily a failing of your relationship. It's that we don't know what our crisis or traumas or moments trigger in them. There's a universe that we don't know about most of the people around us. And I realized, some people just couldn't deal with, the seriousness of my accident, of what I was going through. It was just more than they could handle. And so, I choose to believe that's not because they don't care for me or a failing of the friendship, but because maybe it triggers something in them. And I look at that both as a kindness to myself as well as a kindness to them.
It's giving both of you grace
Yeah.
because we don't know what someone else is going through. And it's so easy to internalize it as it must be because of me. Why don't they love me? Why aren't they there for me? And being able to recognize that it may absolutely have nothing to do with me. And that's okay. And focusing on kind of where you are in the present moment, who's there and what you can do instead of getting so stuck in your head over you can't control someone else's thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. So ruminating on it definitely doesn't help you get through a very, very emotionally and physically difficult journey.
Actually, the driver never apologized or really even acknowledged that, that she was at fault or that I was in a pedestrian crosswalk or, anything. And that was really triggering for me. It actually, sent me down one of the toughest, darkest holes of the journey when I realized there was no human kind of compassion there. But the way I've navigated that is very similarly in believing that maybe her defense mechanism and the way she can handle the fact that she did run over a human 3 times is by not dealing with it. And so that I don't want to dwell on that fact, and so that's how I'm choosing to deal with her as well.
I remember reading that. And then at the end of the book, you have your lessons. And there was one that was like, we're all human, we make mistakes. Make sure you say sorry. Like it's just as much for them as it is for you. And that's so powerful because people don't want to say, I'm sorry. People think it's like weak sometimes to say, I'm sorry, or we feel like too much pride to say it, or we don't want to admit any wrongdoing. And that must be very, very difficult to just not have that acknowledgement in something. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember
It,
reading about her lawyer and hearing it's like, we'll get this like thrown out or something. And
yeah,
that must have been so, how did you go
it
from
was such a
being,
hard day.
yeah,
Well, I think, and even just if you can't say, sorry, and I thought, okay, maybe her lawyer has instructed her not to say sorry or admit guilt. I think there's so many ways you can show that human compassion and kindness, like whether it's like, a touch on the shoulder, like showing up, or a squeeze, or, I wish this didn't happen to you. There's so many different words you can use. But it's again about that caring and connection and some accountability that your actions, caused another person to, you know, be in distress in whatever way.
yeah, it's that human compassion, human connection is so important. And I, from my perspective, I feel that we're losing that a lot in my generation and the younger generations because so much of our communication is via cell phone screens. So we don't always know how. And then I think the pandemic didn't help because
Yeah.
most of our connection for about a year was via screen. And a lot of people, again, in my perspective, not generalizing, but don't know how to really make appropriate eye contact. Like, do I make eye contact? When can I? What is looking at someone too much versus not enough? Can I shake someone's hand? Can I put my hand on the shoulder? Like, there's all these questions of how do I show human connection? Because you weren't able to in those years where you really learn kind of like the boundaries of it. So for those who are maybe listening, who are, I guess, of any age, we're all going through that, learning how to show human compassion. But
Yeah.
what are some other ways that we could maybe show someone some human compassion, that we're there and we care?
Well, I think there are a couple things that you can do. One is, as you had said, showing up and being present. Whether you can make eye contact or not, I think your body language can express whether you're actually invested in the moment or, your mind and is elsewhere. I think the other thing that you can do is, um, if you can share, personal details or things that you're going through and be open. When we share, we give people more confidence in sharing, and it takes somebody leading and initiating, and that can be uncomfortable. But, I found I started a new job during the pandemic and it was all virtual, but by sharing personal things intentionally, I gave people an opening to share something back or to ask some questions. And, that quickly builds a rapport and a trust and, a connection, really. So I think that, that's another way that people can do that. Something that I do in meetings, and everybody has got a different way of communicating and style. And, I'll tell you, after my brain injury, I'm not as comfortable with chaos as I used to be. It's triggering for me, after, having a car run over my head is not quite the same. Um, so, I find sometimes I don't know how to engage in a large chaotic group or when to interject and ask a question. Or so what I say to my audiences and teams is, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, you can ask, jump in and ask me, you can send me a text, communicate any way you want to, but just know that I want to hear your questions, and giving them that recognition that it's okay to interact differently. We don't all have to be the same, but that we want to hear your voice. Sometimes even those simple things can make a difference.
Yes, communication is so important. And I wholeheartedly agree with by answering honestly, we give someone the space to know that it's okay to answer honestly as well and to share what they're going through. That's my biggest thing. If I could get one message across to the world, it's that, how are you? That's why when I start the podcast, it's how are you really? Getting someone to answer honestly. And I try to always respond super honestly so that people know we can talk about it. If you want to talk about something, it's okay to. You don't have to go through anything completely alone in silence and feel like it's something to be ashamed of.
Yeah, you actually bring up a really good point there. I think, one of the things that I try to stress about Unbreakable Day is, look, we've all gone through things. And, most often we put those hard moments, in the closet, think we don't want to talk about it because it can be a downer. But, when you reframe, as you were talking about, with your suicide attempt, when you start to think, what, I survived it. I learned something from it. Yes, it was hard. It was really tough, but I navigated through it, and there are people that help me, let me, go out and have ice cream or celebrate with those people or thank those people. You know, Quite often they probably want to talk about it too, and so we give them, we give all of ourselves a little bit of room to appreciate, you know, uh, how far we've come. And it doesn't make a tough moment less tough, but it does allow you to give yourself the credit that you're due for navigating it.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make it feel less tough. It makes it feel a little less isolating. And I know for me, it gave me a sense of like, wow, I've come so far. I'm not where I was 6 years ago, even in the moments where maybe I feel like I am. Look how much has changed. Instead of bringing myself back into that moment thinking nothing has changed. When you look back, you can celebrate all the small things. I don't know, because I get stuck in that one moment of like, on a hard day and you get triggered with that feeling, and I'm like, oh no, this is how it's always been for the past 6 years. It's not true. So
No.
by reframing it, focusing on all the small things that have happened makes such a difference.
Yeah, it really does. And even so sometimes when I talk to university students or even people, just looking at how do they think about their career, I tell them to look at your, whether it's career or your life and capture your wins. Think about what are those moments that you're proud of and write them down, keep them somewhere. So when you're having your hard days, you can look and say, you know what? I did that. I accomplished this. I learned that. And just remind yourself, as you were saying you were doing, that I have a strength and, a credibility I don't always appreciate, and then you get to look at the people that you also celebrated with in those moments or accomplished those things with, and hopefully highlight it for them too.
Yes, exactly. That is so powerful. I have this like happiness jar, and every night I write 1 to 3 things on a sticky note that made me smile that day. And on those days or weeks where I can't smile, I can go and pull something out. And I remember
Oh,
my friend calling me and how excited it made me when like Sam FaceTimed me, or when I went for a walk and it was finally sunny, and that was so exciting.
I
Um,
love that.
and then I think some of my friends find me very annoying because I make them take a picture every time we're together. They're like,
Oh,
we're on a walk and we're sweaty. I'm like, for you, that's how you're going to remember this? Maybe. For me, when I'm feeling like you didn't answer my text and I've internalized it as something is wrong with me and you're mad at me, I can look at the picture and say, oh no, we just had fun together. I'm not always alone. And just my brain tends to go to the negative intrusive thought. So finding these small things that I could do to remind me is so helpful. And that's the thing. We have to find what works for us to help that perspective shift. Because I mean, your story is proof that that perspective shift, the way you tell your story to yourself, matters.
yeah, it really does. So, and look, I'm never going to say it's easy. And, sometimes I feel like I take a step forward and a step back. So I intentionally try to remind myself of the lessons and the things that I wrote about in the sermon. And, I've gotten a bunch of tattoos in the last few years. One of the tattoos I have is this one, Ichigo Ichii, and it's kind of one time, one moment. It's from the Japanese tea ceremonies. And you can tell this to your friends next time they don't want a picture. The people that we are in this moment, we will never be again. So let's be fully present together because we'll never return to this moment.
It's so true. We'll never be in this moment again. So let's enjoy the most of it. And that's something I've been working on lately. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this. I love to have my phone next to me. I it's always next to me. I'm always looking at it. I wish I wasn't. I wish I could say that I never have the desire to check Instagram 10 times a day, but I do. So I've been learning to put it on do not disturb or personal and put it like in my purse when I'm with my friends at lunch. And that might sound like so silly and simple. And of course you should do
Oh,
that. But I feel like I was so trained not to do that, to always have my phone near me, and realizing that taking the picture, usually I remember halfway through because I keep my phone away now. And just being present with that person in the moment, actually experiencing it instead of being on my phone, like messaging her back on Instagram when we're sitting across from each other.
I love that. And it's a compliment to the people that you're with too, that you do care about them and you do want to be with them.
And
The other thing that you made me think of is, when we were talking about this age of social media, one of the interesting comments that I got after the accident, and so I talked about how before the accident, I really, tried to juggle this crazy life, or maybe I didn't like, I juggled this wonderful, very rich life, but I did it and I tried to make it look easy. And I was very proud of that, not needing help in any way. And somebody said to me after the accident that I was an unsympathetic character because I did make it look so easy. and I did look like I had it all together. I mean, it wasn't easy and I didn't have it all together, but I was good with that facade. And I think with social media too, we all have the facade of the good times. And so people don't see the tougher moments that make us real, that make us relatable and build that connection. And I think that is probably isolating for the person that's sharing the facade as well as the people that are absorbing it.
I I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I really do. I'm always like, I hate it, but then I'm on it 24/7. Gotta learn boundaries for myself. But it's so fun to go and post something exciting and then have your friends like comment how great you look and how amazing this is, this accomplishment or whatever. But then you do feel like you always have to show up that way online. And then when you're only seeing that from other people, at least for me, it turns into a comparison game. Like, oh, they're always so happy. They're always accomplishing new things. Oh, they never go through anything difficult. Life must be so amazing for them. What's wrong with me? Why is my life not like that? And it just spirals these messages of, well, now I need to put on even a braver face and pretend like everything's 10 times better than it is. So that way people think I'm good enough. And it leads to, at least again for me, this comparison game of honestly against myself of who I am and who I wish I would be. And then parts of me that I kind of force myself to hate for just being human.
So, I'm sure you are not alone in that. In fact, I know you're not alone. So many people struggle with that with social media. But you did say something very interesting, actually, that I think we're going to reframe right now.
Okay.
You talked about comparing yourself to yourself, which I love that you're thinking about yourself, not, hopefully not against the other person, but that's, the start of the growth mindset is how do you look at yourself, the me today versus the me yesterday, and am I a little bit better of a person than I was yesterday? And, I think if you start to reframe it, not as, oh, I want to be as happy as, so and so, but am I a little happier than I was yesterday? Or have I done anything to make my life a little better or reach this goal? Kind of what one step forward did I take?
Yeah, wait, I love that because it's reflecting. I think, how do I word this? I think for me, I tend to kind of reflect and compare myself against this sometimes unrealistic, as my therapist would say, unrealistic idea of who I should be and where I should be in life. And if I stopped doing that all the time and actually looked at where was I yesterday? Where was I 2 days ago? Look how much has changed. I might not be so hard on myself all the time. You're really good at this.
Thank you. It's a lovely conversation.
One thing that I do want to read, I read it to you when we first got on, but it was I don't think this is my favorite because it was all really good, but this is one of my favorite things that I read in the book. And I highlighted and I posted it on my Instagram story. For anyone who's following me, probably saw it. But it says, turns out you get to pick your story too. You get to decide the words you choose, how you describe yourself and your life. You get to decide to imagine the possibilities. You shape your story. You tell your story. That is so powerful. I think for so long, for me, and I'm sure many people relate to that, you grow up with messaging of who you should be and what your life should look like. And then you get to a place where you're an adult and you can start replacing shoulds with wants. It's really difficult, but just the way you said it gave me this sense of hope that my life doesn't have to be defined and dictated by the voices that I am now at 26 years old, slowly learning to quiet.
And, I love, I'm so glad that that resonated. I shared in my book that I tried to commit suicide when I was young as well. And I've never really talked about it. But I realized, I should talk about it. And, because we need to remind people that we do write our own story. At 16, I didn't know that my story could change. I thought I was, that person that wasn't so happy with herself was it, and it wasn't going to get any better. I didn't know that I could write my own story. And I think it's so important that we we remind people of that.
Yes, it is so true. It might feel like this is gonna last forever, but it won't. It really so my tattoo is the semicolon, and that's the if you could end a sentence with like a period or a semicolon, you end with a sentence. You end with a period, it's the end of a sentence, but you can use semicolon to continue going, to keep going. So it's like my reminder to keep going. On those moments that feel like it's infinite, and it's forever, and this is the end, you can do a semicolon, right? And continue the story and
That is beautiful.
rewrite or change the narrative just a little bit. And that is one of the most powerful things for me that I've learned the past 6 years is you do get to, you hold the pen to your story. You have a lot more, I was like you have control of everything because you don't, but you have a lot more control than you give yourself credit for. You have a lot more power and capability that we often give ourselves credit for. And reading that really was the reminder that I needed.
Oh, yay. Thank you, Francesca.
I've really enjoyed talking with you, reading your book. For those listening who want to buy your book, how do they find it?
Oh, they can find it at Amazon, really anywhere books are sold, but you can get a paperback, a hardcover, a Kindle, an Audible, and it's me telling the story on Audible. So you'll hear me again.
You're so amazing. As we are wrapping up, what's one last thing you'd like to leave our audience with?
Well, I'm going to say, look, Unbreakable Day is coming up. It's May 21st. And, I hope that everyone takes that day, or if you want to choose another Unbreakable Day, but remember to take that moment and give yourself a little credit for all you've navigated, and thank the people in your life that have helped you in those moments, and give yourself a little credit.
Thank you so much for listening to Normalize the Conversation. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. This podcast is an initiative of Inspiring My Generation, focusing on normalizing the conversation, bringing education and awareness to the forefront, and amplifying global voices to spark change and hope. Inspiring My Generation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization on a mission towards suicide prevention through awareness, conversation, education, and support. Connect with us on Instagram at Inspiring My Generation and visit our website inspiringmygeneration.org to learn more about our work and how you can make a difference.